So one of the classes I hope to start teaching in the next week or two will be an examination, particularly about science, atheism, secularism, because I feel like these are the forces that are acting upon us today, but in ways in which we're not really consciously aware of in some ways. And the modern world has a funny way of giving you the feeling that this is the way things always have been, or the way they ought to be. But one of the source materials we'll be using for the upcoming class, inshallah, is this book by Paul C. Vitz. He's a psychologist who has written a number of articles and books. This one's called Faith of the Fatherless, the Psychology of Atheism. And it kind of dovetailed today with something that I was reading online about. There was a comment by Mehdi Hassan, who for some is a beloved Muslim journalist, and he made a comment today that I found really interesting. But I want to start first with this comment by Vitz, in which he says that atheism is an assumption made by certain people about the nature of the world, and these people have been, in the past century, extraordinarily successful at controlling the acceptable view on the matter. In particular, there seems to be a widespread assumption. That's the part I want to highlight. In particular, there seems to be a widespread assumption throughout much of our intellectual community that belief in God is based on all kinds of irrational, immature needs and wishes, whereas atheism or skepticism flows from a rational, grown-up, no-nonsense view of things as they really are. So particularly this assumption, right? Now, Mehdi Hassan today wrote that he said, I now believe, well, I don't know if he wrote it today, but he made this comment. Looks like it was today. He said, I now believe that you can't really live in a secular society without supporting a legal right to marry for same-sex couples. I do. But I still cringe as I remember how I made my own contribution to homophobic discourse back in my 20s over a decade ago. I can only apologize. I found this line of thinking to be, not only flawed, but in some ways dishonest, and some of that dishonesty may be mixed with, again, this assumption or presumption about the way things ought to be or the way things are. And I know that there's been a lot of work in the last several years to really separate atheism and secularism into two different categories. And while I do believe they are not necessarily synonymous with one another, it also doesn't mean that there isn't a fair amount of congruence between the two as well. And there's a lot to examine in Mehdi's words, because I do believe they represent a growing sentiment within our community, within the Muslim community, that has been enthralled and enchanted by the left, by liberalism, and that is this idea of you can't really live in a secular society without supporting the right for same-sex marriage. I don't see that necessity. Number one, I don't see that demand. That, to be honest, I don't see where secular society is actually making that demand of us. Now, that the right exists and people have the right to do so, is very different than, us having to essentially go out and fulfill that. I don't see where in America, and of course I think Mehdi Hassan lives in the UK, but to my knowledge, neither of these secular Western liberal governments are telling us we must advocate for us. It's more of like, well, these are our laws. Okay, fine. People can go and do what they will with those laws. That doesn't mean I have to necessarily advocate for it. And what is cringeworthy is, what do you mean by advocate? That you can't really live in a secular society without supporting. What do you mean by support? We have a moral obligation actually to not support it. And simply because our moral worldview may never become the dominant worldview doesn't mean that, well, you just sort of like, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So I'm really having a hard time seeing how he's able to reconcile this. Although, given what Vitz is saying in his book about this assumption, it really shows how our psychologies are being tremendously influenced by what I would call a kind of atheism here, where there is a congruence between atheism and secularism. So inshallah, I hope in the next week or two to be able to start this class. This is just one of the reading materials, inshallah, that we'll be using. I'll try to make some of it available, online, but I hope that you can attend in person at the center. Jazakumullahu khairan. Sorry, I'm trying to get over a sinus infection. So I hope this was informative. Hope to see you at the center. Assalamu alaikum.